Okay, I think everyone is back. Love to hear anything that you heard in your breakout rooms that sparked a new idea or you thought was especially interesting. Looks like Mustafa, jump right in.
Just a quick comment. I think it was a common sentiment where a lot of the prior thought before the course, I think, in fact, Gavin just was mentioning like he thought things through in a similar way, but not in the right terms or what have you. So we're kind of like, it's like, yeah, we thought about that, but now here's the more formalized method to think about things, right? So it's a good process of kind of like realizing things that maybe we thought about but left behind, and as we're moving along in our implementations and stuff. So I thought that's a good sentiment, and I think overall it was a great session, at least for us.
Go ahead, Darren.
I don't really have more to add. It's just kind of, we ran out of the time pretty much at the end. So it was about question number 3, about the best ways to classify queries to estimate return on investment. And like the most common trend is just like how much time is saved. What is the employee that you base salary times time saved? And that was a quick return on investment. I'd really like to dig more into that, understand, because I know we talked about the 80-20 principles yesterday, trying to identify which areas have the best return on investment. And I'd just love to know if anyone else has like a different formula or a different way to approach these things to convey it to other people.
I can talk about that a little bit, only through the lens of the construction work that we were doing. We didn't really have any kind of frameworks in mind when we were trying to understand and estimate the impact that we had on these question types. A lot of what we actually did in practice was just user research, right? And so when we did our analysis, we had found, okay, a portion of our questions were around like who were the owners of documents and who created those documents and if they were up to date. Many questions were around understanding the deadlines. And so when we saw the volume of questions per question type, we had a general idea that, okay, many people are just searching for documents because they don't really know what they want to look for. They just want to know that I'm on this project, let me go find the forms I need to look up. As we not only did that research in terms of how much the user base was using the product, we also went to the experts and said, how impactful are these kinds of questions? In these different categories, we found these kind of questions be asked more often than not. What are your actual workflows and what are the things that we could probably productize for you in a different way? For example, if you're asking the same questions every day in the morning, could we send you up like an email, like a newsletter type format where, when procurement forms come in, you ask the same 3 questions. Would you want to have automations that can do this kind of data extraction instead, rather than having you enter these forms? Why do you enter these forms? What is the impact? What do you think is the return on investment? Is a lot of it just going to be time that you save your contractors, or is there something else going on? And the biggest one they came back to us with was, it is actually very important to figure out when contracts were being signed too close to the deadline for labor. Because if you could avoid that, we would avoid a multi-day delay in a construction project. Our margins are really low. And so really, if you could just tell us, if you were able to answer questions not only about deadlines, but deadlines and contracts and laborers, this would save us like $50,000. And we realized that, this is a proportion of the question set that is very low because the only people who care are the one supervisor and the one general contractor on this project. But now the impact is high enough that this is something that we want to investigate more. And now we're thinking of like the workflows we can use to de-risk projects, right? And now when you sort of present the vision of this chat app, it's not enterprise document search, or it is not a question answering system. Here now what we can sell to our customer is, we're going to try to minimize this kind of profit erosion that you produce. And we are building specific targeted tools to allow you to avoid having delays in your project, right? Which is a much bigger outcome than just saying, well, the contractors show up a little hungover, they don't know where the drywall is, and they can like ask the job site and stuff like that. But a lot of that starts with user research. Does that tell like a clear thread of an experience, of an anecdote we've had?
Yeah, so it helps. It's just like we were talking to other business people, and it always comes down to what's the return on investment, and it was always generally, okay, what's the average, salary of the person that's using that, how much time saved. Generally, that was a quick one, and it was just how you better articulate, like what you're talking now is like, you can identify daily questions that are asked generally, and maybe just like, hey, and you do a daily email, and then you'll talk about contracts. So I think that's the parts I was trying to look for, is how do you take another step up? What's the leverage I'm looking for? So yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah, an even more direct way of asking this, if you have people who can answer this well, would be, hello, like customer. I've noticed that a large proportion of the questions that you generate are of this category of scheduling questions. What's at stake to the business when we can answer these well and when we don't answer these well, right? What is the return on investment if you could do this perfectly? And like, what are you willing to invest to make that happen? For example, with understanding the critical path of a schedule, today we can answer the question, contracts are due this week that are not signed. That's a very simple question. But would you want us to build a system that can figure out the critical path of this construction project? That's going to take a lot of work. How much do you think like you would save if you could prevent delays of this kind of category? Oh, we would probably save about $200,000. Okay, well that's pretty good, right? Our product is $200 a month, so this is a great deal for you. Whereas the like drywall question really has like very minimal net value. But I think just asking like, what is at stake for the business if we were able to answer this question well, I think is a good way of sort of getting to it, right?
Yeah, I think it's because we don't have enough information sometimes on the people we're trying to sell to, and it's trying to understand their business before that. And just having some things to pivot on, that's mainly what I wanted to get it from. So you nailed all that. Appreciate it.
Perfect. Dylan?
Yeah, my question more around synthetic data generation, to be honest, from last week, but it came up as we were talking in the group. When you have the case where you're generating kind of synthetic questions from your chunks, and a question that's generated can be answered by that chunk you generated from or another chunk somewhere else in your corpus, how do you have kind of tricks of dealing with that in the case where you don't want to go through and label your whole corpus, for example?
Ultimately, if that is the case, really the risk is having sort of an underreported precision, right? It's just sort of understanding that, okay, like these precision metrics might not be as low as they really are, and maybe in the performance that we might observe in a production setting, it will be on average like higher, right? That's kind of just the way I think about it. If we know this is happening a lot because a lot of documents are duplicates, again, it's just understanding that as long as these metrics are moving directionally in the right direction, moving positively in the right direction, we're making progress, right? It's almost like if the scale is off by 5 pounds, I don't really care. But as long as I'm just like using the same scale, then I'm understanding that whether or not I'm trying to move towards the goal that I have. But that said, a lot of like, I don't want to label the data, I don't want to look at the data. I still think it is very important to do that homework, because that's the only way we're going to be able to build any kind of like user empathy or even empathy with the language model, right? Because maybe you find something interesting where 2 text chunks seem to answer the question, but they're contradicting. You go, why is that? Is this because of the language of this industry? What's going on? Like, you know, the rare examples will often teach you a lot about the system that you're building.
Yeah. Okay. Fair.
Alex?
Yeah, it was just kind of a comment. And then also when you're talking about like looking at the data, what's the impact of the business? One of the things that got going on my mind when you're like, oh, we could build a tool for this, and some of that 80-20, I can't remember who asked the question before that led it to you, but you know, we've been thinking about ideas where it's like, well, we can't do this. And like you said, like make the system aware that it can't, but offer basically, okay, we're not going to build a tool to automate this whole thing, but here's the like guide on how to do it so that you can just do it. We're like basically surfacing an equivalent of like a help desk article, right? To be like, we'll never build this tool, but here's the fast way to do it, because there's like some tips and tricks for shortcuts and stuff that you can just be faster as a human, right? And you're just like, oh, well, that cost us basically nothing to build, but it made them go 20% faster in that case. So yeah.
Cool. And then Arshath?
Hey, thank you, Jason. Yeah, so my question is one about segmentization, which you mentioned yesterday. There are quite a bit of this kind of token models that are out there for classification. And I've looked at something called Gleaner. And what do you think about that? And can it really be used for this segmentization at the end of it?
Can you spell out the product?
Gleaner. Gliner. That's a model that is out there in Hugging Face, I think. We have tested that, but with varying degrees of success. Then whether you put it at the end for evaluation, or would you actually also put it somewhere at the start? When the question comes in, you classify it, and so it routes it in a better direction.
I see. Let me just take a look at this thing and see if I can understand it. So one thing that's worth calling out is it is unlikely that the clusters and topics a like generic clustering model will actually be the ones you use in the production setting. Like it's really going to be the case where we have a bunch of user questions, we put it into 15 clusters, and now we can put it in a Datadog, and there's just going to be 15 time series on it, right? The clustering models really should be a tool to help you view summaries of your data that is very like extractive, right? If you just paste in a 10,000 questions into a language model, it's likely going to just produce a very weak summary of what's going on. It's like, oh, people are asking questions about construction, and it's not going to be very informative. So the topic modeling's job is just to present you clusters that then you can inspect with your domain experts to then figure out what is actually going on, right? It's kind of it's a tool just to help you summarize the data. It's not something that actually you use in the production setting. I think ultimately you should try to develop strong opinions on how people are using your software and build those specific tools. And so maybe you find out that a lot of people are asking about the need to have time filters, right? It's rarely going to be the case that is just a cluster you uncover, but just finding similarities and being able to inspect that data in a much more summarized way is the goal of these models. And whether you use like a language model, whether you use embeddings or BERT topic, that's going to be part of the experimentation, right? It's not going to be the actual result that you use to like back the classifier, if that makes sense.
Yep, it makes sense. One quick one, user adoption. I mean, you have the people who champion the products within the company, but the final users are laymen that are operational workers or finance workers. We have been having hard time getting them actually to use the product. So how would you go about it? Because you worked on a construction company and it's...
Yeah, I think a lot of it is when technical teams build products, they focus too much on the features of it all. And so we'll say like, we implemented a new like image search index, right? It's like twice as fast and it's like 16% recall. And that might be useful to like report that to your tech lead, but that's not really how we might want to think about marketing or advertising these features to the consumer, right? And so ultimately, the way we think about doing it, at least for the construction context or for the sales context, it's really going to be around focusing on what the pain that they're really feeling is, like emphasizing that pain, and then demonstrating with a lot of proof that we can alleviate that pain. I guess there's a general equation, which is going to be, what is the dream outcome that the user wants to have? Can we demonstrate that we are going to make that more likely to succeed? And can we make sure it's going to take them less time and less effort? And if you can present those three variables and then sort of emphasize that dream again, that's where things become a lot more tractable. So in the example of being able to find contracts that need to be signed urgently, we don't really say like we built a new index that allows you to query whether or not contracts are signed, right? You say, hey everyone, we understand the pain of dealing with delays because working with people is very complicated. And what we want to like share with you is a tool that can help you avoid like profit erosion, right? Here's a case study. There's been like every company has cases where we expect things to arrive on a Friday. We don't have the right paperwork, and so things are delayed, which costs you hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? And with our new AI tool, we can identify these things for you like every morning, right? So that's like the time component, right? And here are 2 customers that have done this use this technology, and here are the outcomes they've given. And now you increase like the probability of success. So now you're saying like, look, like this problem you have is a $100,000 problem, and we're just trying to help you solve that problem, right? Rather than going like, hey, we have an index that classifies whether or not, like if you just like, we have a vision model that scans PDFs and checks if a paperwork is signed, the consumer's not going to realize that, oh, the real pain is plumbers show up and they have nothing to do. We just pay each person $90 an hour for the whole day, and I just lost 20 grand.
Right. Thank you.
Focus on the pain is going to be a big piece. Daniel?
That's very true.
I asked my question on Dory as well, but I thought it's better to elaborate a little bit on that. So my use case is the following. I'm at quite at early stages in my retrieval service, and so I don't have any user interface right now. But I'm highly interested in detecting areas of improvement. So my question would be, what advice do you have if you don't have a direct user feedback? Because my idea, for instance, would be, and I'd like to have your thoughts on that, would be just given I take the recall, for instance, as proxy, then doing a categorization. And if I notice, for instance, okay, there is a specific category that has a lower recall compared to the average recall, then this might be my call for action that I could take and improve on that specific category.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the right idea. Right? Like if you're building this product for a specific type of use case, then it makes sense that you can do some of this work with just synthetic data. Because again, if you think, for example, that you are going to expect to see a lot of user queries around comparisons, right? We can then just synthetically generate those kind of questions, run these models, and maybe then just label this data for relevancy.
So recall
I
might
definitely think
also be a trigger compared to if you don't have direct user feedback, because it's a quite huge gap to implement that in a user interface to have a thumbs up, thumbs down if you're in early stages. So that is why I was wondering if there are any other proxies that I can rely on to identify areas of improvement.
Yeah. I mean, if you have nothing, you at least have like the cosine distances, you at least have the cohere ranker scores, right? And just see like, are there any segments of the population that has really low relevancy? Maybe something's going on there. For example, when I first built out a synthetic data generation example, we used Paul Graham's essays. And we found no matter what we did, we basically got 96% accuracy for lexical search, 97% for semantics. Oh, good, like this works. We took that same approach to search GitHub issues across all GitHub issues, and our recall was just like 60.
I see.
Right? For the same code that generates synthetic questions. And what we realized was a question would just be like, how do I get started? And you realize that we're missing a lot of additional filtering that we need to understand how to address these problems, right? And it's like, oh, okay, well, first we need to filter out by repo. So let me do that now. And then you search by repo, and then you realize, oh, what we're missing is the ability to resolve a repository to a like direct filter against another tool, right? And so you realize that if you just like React repo, there's 100 of them. So, okay, not only do I need to resolve the repository, there's going to be many copies of the repository. I need to rank it somehow. Okay, so really I need to clarify. A lot of this work is going to be around resolving like the natural language query with the repository I want to filter on. If I can do that well, then I can build out a GitHub search system that says like, what's the best way to contribute to React? And then you can say, oh, well, we're going to assume it's going to be like the React/React repo because that has 20,000 stars, and we're going to filter that when we do our search, right? And you can still do that in the absence of any kind of user data.
Yeah. So, but my proposed approach is definitely not wrong. Better than nothing.
Yeah.
Thank you.
No problem. Christopher?
Question about general tips for multi-source. Like when you have 3 or 4 different sources, one of them is an API, one's an RDBMS, maybe a graph. Just looking for some general tips. Right now, I try to let the LLMs handle a lot of it by providing markdown tables to each other, and that's working okay, but I wonder if you've been down similar paths and said this has shown to work really well, or we always put it in an RDBMS even if we don't need it, or what you do.
What do you mean by putting everything in a markdown table?
Oh, just like so I get a result back from the graph rag, right? And I can have it in a pandas data frame, or I can just output it to Markdown and send it to the next level, the next agent who is looking to find the contractor with the most money for that year, and it can pretty much pull that with confidence from the table.
Sorry, okay, maybe I didn't understand the question. Sorry.
So when you have a situation where you have many different data sources for your RAG, like 3 plus, have you worked with that enough to say, as far as getting them all to talk the same way and talk to the same way? How do you approach that? Do you generally align them to the same structure and say, no, I'm going to put these all in an RDBMS even only for a minute. I'm just going to try to handle this with the pandas data frame, or going to lean on the LLMs a lot. It's just so many discrete types of data, and getting those aligned so they can work with each other and answer the same question.
There's a lot of sort of other variables at play, like latency, for example, but I would say for the most part, these multi-step agents are pretty good for ad hoc work, right? So I make one query, I put it back in the context, and I generate another query. The issue ends up being whether or not you can reproduce that across many examples, right? And so right now, what do you think is the main issue with what you're doing? Is it the case that when something really amazing happens with one of your clients, they can't reproduce that because it's hard to few shot this like multi-stage reasoning? Or is it the case that the language model is not able to choose the right tool or choose the right data source?
I think the the main issue is it feels like such a slog from my side to make sure when we get a new question that's in scope that I don't feel like I have a standard way of approaching it from each of these different. If I need to involve 3 sources, I need to look at it every time and say, okay, is the way these are doing this, does that work for this new question? And like I said, markdown tables is where I've been going, and the LLMs kind of pass those around because they're not deep analytical questions. It's usually just aggregates.
Yeah, I think it's gonna be tough to give any specific advice. But if you like message me on Slack, we can jam on this a little bit more. So yeah, it's hard to sort of for me to visualize like what is the limiting factor. Like in terms of like whether or not markdown is great. Like I think whatever you can do, at least for like the OpenAI models, all of it is going to be trained on markdown. Whereas in Claude, most things are going to be trained on XML. Those are just sort of like some small distinctions.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think for the most part, we might have to look at some examples of queries and see what's failing. Yeah, just message me on Slack and we can chat about that. Cool. Manny Condon?
Yeah, hey, so one thing which I wanted to talk about was around the capabilities. So the use case that I wanted to mention was about the troubleshoot based search, which is around the technical domain where if support engineer solves a particular support ticket, he creates a knowledge artifact. This is the issue, this is the solution, and this is how to solve it. So that the next time a similar type of issues comes in, you could actually like, if the user outcome here is that the end outcome is that we want to really like enable the customer not to create support tickets so that they can solve it really quickly by themselves. So the user interface here is more around, there is this small summary of the issue and then the more detailed description about this. So if I think about it, one of the main thing which that is preventing is that not one user is this, each users are different and they describe it very differently. It's right now it's just lexical search and most of them are handled in a custom fine-tuned re-ranker, which is I feel like the things that I keep on hearing here is that why are they facing this particular issue? What is, if they are able to actually accomplish this, what is the end outcome that if they can able to resolve this issue quick, how can we enable to do that if the retriever is performing really well? So I feel like the query understanding part of, okay, how can we actually like clearly grok, because there is so many different products, and as an engineer, it's very hard for me to even review the data itself. What is the user intent? What are the different metadata attributes? So my question is, can we able to use LLMs to even help with assisting this blob of text? Okay, just what is the user intent? How can we actually like extract, what are the different metadata, and how can we resolve this into a more structured query that we can send it to the retriever? Could you touch upon the query understanding capability a bit, Jason?
Yeah, most of what I do in practice, when I have just a lot of unstructured data that I don't really know what to do with, I end up just doing that batch classification task across many different axes, right? And so, like, if you go back to the construction example, like, I just had like a hour-long conversation with the chief product officer and say, okay, like, just tell me like what kind of things you see on a daily basis. Okay, I think I have like 5 or 6 different hypotheses on what is possible, right? Maybe some idea of like what kind of metadata people are searching for. And then I'll just build these classification prompts and just run that across the entire data set. And the goal really is I'm trying to sort of data mine the existing user data to verify some of these hypotheses. So again, it's, I think people really care about like schedules and deadlines and whatever. Okay, let me just build a classifier really quick that says how many of these questions are around understanding deadlines, right? You run that, it takes like $40, it takes like 20 minutes, and then you just have an estimate of that proportion. Okay, this is something important. Maybe we should go build out some SQL table that has this kind of information in it, right? A lot of what I've done myself is going to just be like building these lightweight classification prompts using chain of thought and just data mining everything, right? And then you can say, you know what, like, okay, for these examples that have scheduling questions, let's just print out 100 of them. Let's get the CPO on the phone on Zoom, and let's just scroll through and just look at what's interesting and what you're noticing. And then maybe they come back and say, hey, these random numbers you see in the question, I think they're supposed to be like RFI IDs. It's like, great, let's have that as a field, right? Let's add that in the prompt that says if there are like codes that look like this format, they're usually like 3 numbers with 3 letters, try to search against RFI to see if we can subsample this a little bit better, right? Or like one example we had with financial research was we found a lot of data that just like we're mentioning years in the future, and we're like, well, what's going on here? And again, we go back to the experts. It's like, okay, find me all the examples where they're asking questions about 2024 and 2023. And then we realized, oh, what's really happening is there's an idea of like a fiscal year, and the fiscal year does not end in December for some industries. And so if we could just resolve that better, we can do better filtering, right? We can do better comparisons because we can ask FY23 is not filtering by the published date or something. And those specific examples are the things that gets us like 10, 20% improvements in recall because we were just able to filter out so much data. But a lot of it ends up being like data mining these things using language models.
Yeah, could you share probably offline the structured prompt that you would try as part of just a couple of examples would be really helpful, Jason.
Yeah,
Just
let
as part
me
of the
see.
data analysis.
Yeah, let me see if I can open up something and then share that. I don't know if I've actually. Cool. So I'm just trying to share my screen. 1 second. So one thing I do in practice is I effectively have a giant YAML file that I make leadership look at, where I have basically like the task, a description of the task, and then I give it different labels. And so here's like I want to show 2 examples in my prompt, whatever. This is the label that I care about. It's like questions relating to authorization and permissions. I'll give a couple of positive and negative examples. And effectively, this configuration is a description of the data that I can just share to like non-technical stakeholders. He's like, hey, does this make sense? Like, are these the kind of questions you see? These are bad questions. Give me some good questions. And then usually I just have like a helper function load this in and build out a prompt. And so here, all I have is the system message just like lists out the task, the description, and all the labels. And for all the labels, I give positive and negative examples, like positive examples, negative examples, some other descriptions. And then I just like run this in some like async IO call that just says like batch predict every row in this CSV file. Great. Group by count, for group, like print 10 examples. Now that I've organized things, does the data still make sense? And this ends up just being jumping on Zoom calls, copy pasting code in Slack and going like, hey, I found out that this is something that's been happening, or like, what does this mean? How come this shows up so often? What's actually going on in this question answering system? And this code is like in the GitHub. And all it does is it effectively reads this YAML file that sort of specifies the problem and allows you to build a classifier to do this kind of task. But it's pretty straightforward if you take a look at the code. And then anytime like any product manager, or tech lead has some kind of hypothesis they want to test and verify, we can just go in and just sort of spend $40, label everything and go, okay, I've learned something, or maybe I've not learned something. But it should have only taken me 30 minutes. But yeah, if any other questions, like hit me up on Slack. I can like walk through that code a little bit more. Let's jump to Jay, and then also do some of the Dory questions.
Okay, thanks for taking my question. I work for a publishing company that publishes about 20,000 legal articles, right? And usually people land on our site through Google, and a lot of them bounce because they're not in the right article. So I'm building this. Our initial thought was, let's build an answering engine that looks at our articles based on and gives them an answer back. And I've been reading your blog for a while, and I followed query planning, hybrid search, and some of those steps. And our answers are, at least our internal users have been happy with the answers. But the problem that we have not cracked yet is how, like the intent extraction. Usually people reading legal articles have a legal problem and they're looking for something. And our main business is around generating, if a user has the need for a lawyer, then we will connect them with a lawyer, right? And intent extraction, at least that's the word I have in my mind now. Like, how do I get people? Right now, our search engine is people typing keywords, or people land on our site and bounce. So I'm trying to reduce that and get people's intent so I can serve them the right article, or see if they are fit for a lawyer. Is the answering engine the right modality for that? Is the right answer for that? Like, what do you think we should be doing there?
I guess really what we're trying to build is almost like a recommendation system where we are dynamically changing the CTA based on some input query, right? That to me is like a pretty straightforward classification task, right? And so the first question is, okay, let's go back to that example where I had this YAML file that described things. There's really going to be a couple of actions we want to take, right? I don't really know about the lawyer example, but I can give an example from like a supplements company that I'd worked with a little bit, where given the chat, we could schedule a personal trainer, we can render a calorie calculator, or we could like sell them some supplements and then like book a call if you're doing some bulk orders, right? And effectively, we just wanted to make sure that when we render any of these 4 actions, that they are being taken. And so the feedback mechanism, instead of a thumbs up or thumbs down, might be to either like minimize bounce rate or take an action against one of these CTAs. But I think from an LLM perspective, you can just potentially build some kind of classifier, right? Where we maybe see like there's like 4 tools at your disposal. Given the question and the answer, choose one of these 4 tools to call, and it could just be the book a lawyer. But maybe the book a lawyer tool has additional information like what zip code they're in or what kind of additional context you can provide to not only book the lawyer, but to recommend a lawyer. But here you basically have a data set where today you have just search, answer, and then a recommended action, and then whether or not they took that action. If you can build that data set, you can iterate on the prompts to make sure we are selecting the right tool based on that action, based on the feedback. And then if you have 1,000 examples, 2,000 examples, then you can think about fine tuning what will effectively look like a classifier, or just fine tuning a tool calling function that says, okay, in this context, it looks like they want to find a lawyer. So I'm going to call the like find lawyer tool.
Yeah.
But the find lawyer tool has an additional query that is the type of lawyer, right? Maybe this is an accident or this is like real estate or something. You can start pre-filling these search queries.
Yeah.
And you can imagine in the long run, you have a system that says like, here's the answer, here's the question you asked, here's the answer, here's like the 10 lawyers near you that are accident lawyers that we've searched and we've personalized based on your context, because you're talking about, I broke my foot at school, can I sue the janitor? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, it's mostly
you think of almost like a tool calling API.
Yeah, it's mostly in their head, and they type in keywords, and sometimes they type in the wrong keywords. They are not necessarily, it could be, for example, they might have met with an accident and they say search for accident lawyers, but actually they met with an accident at the company where they work, and it's a workers' compensation issue. Like they don't even, sometimes users don't know which lawyer to go to. And like we have, it is a recommendation problem based on it. Tell us, getting more details out of them so we can recommend the right lawyer for them. Because so if they go to the wrong lawyer, the system, that's lost on all parts. Yeah.
In that situation, like a part of me would want to like data mine the user logs and see if I could find what are sort of common like ways of rerouting questions. So given if this was the input, what were the final actions that I took? Can I use them as examples? So for example, maybe this is a chat app, right? In which case you can say, given the answer and the question, give a response. But if this is the initial class, here are the 5 other potential classes we might need to transition to. Or more specifically, here are 5 good questions that we could ask to add additional information, right?
I see.
Like for example, if it's an accident, like I think one question is just like, where did the accident happen?
Yeah.
Right. If you could classify as an accident, we could have a YAML file that says like, if it's classified as an accident, ask these other questions to specify. And again, we can probably just write those out, right? I don't have enough of the log context to really have a good intuition, but I'm pretty sure we can just write out that intake form.
There are definitely qualifying questions, right? Qualifying questions, and some questions are not, like lawyers won't take them because if you met with an accident 5 years ago, there's nothing I can do, right? So like those are disqualifying questions and routing questions. So, yeah.
Yeah, but I really believe that you can probably just have a very detailed prompt that can take you almost halfway there, or just say, let me just classify what the current setting is. If it's classified as an accident, I can load in what the follow-up question should be. Like probably like when did it happen? Where did it happen? Was it personal or employment? Like those might actually just be the options, and those can just be written down in code.
Thank you.
Cool. Does that answer it a little bit?
Yeah, part of it. I have a second part. Maybe next time. I'll ask next time. It's more.
Just message me on Slack as well. Oh, go on.
The other part is, so this is, we have a find a lawyer form, which is more static questions, but making it more dynamic makes it. We've seen some success with asking dynamic questions. The other part is people reading articles. Like most of our traffic comes to people reading articles, but they don't find information on that article. But I'm pretty sure that there is information somewhere. Like we have written 20,000 articles and we keep them updated. So the answer is somewhere, right? That's where I thought the answering engine maybe or an answer tool where they can just we give the answer to them, and then the suggested questions, or is this, ask them a follow-up, is this a good, are you talking about this topic, or show them a few suggested questions so they can follow their, so sort of it's in your head, you just typed in a few keywords, but now we're asking you some follow-up questions, and then we click on a follow-up. That gives us more understanding of where they are.
Is there any backing data right now that tracks, given someone's search query and like the article ID that they viewed, what was the final action they took, like on the company site? Like, was the final action, like in a session, they first landed on this page, something happened, they booked a lawyer. We might, like, this might just be a case where it might be worthwhile just to do like some pure data science and just say, given the first article ID, do we have any signal that predicts what was the final action? Not the intermediate action, but just the final action. If you have 20,000 articles, I imagine there's been enough traffic where it's probably like, okay, given this article ID, there's a 1% chance they book an accident lawyer, but an accident lawyer, that's like an employment thing.
Yeah.
Just like making that into the platform.
Yeah, we force them to a lawyer. If they were reading an auto accident lawyer, the system sends them to an auto accident system lawyer. So maybe if I look for where it made a mistake, that could give some numbers. Yeah. But I have that. So from a given article page, what kind of leads were generated and which ones were wrong, like, can give me a sense. Exactly. Yeah.
And if you just have like if this was the initial lead and it was wrong, what was the like proposed lead? Again, we can basically sort of like build out like this Markov chain of like transitions, and then just say, okay, now that we have this Markov chain, let's try to put it back in the prompt and see if we can do it like first try or something like that. But I think a lot of it will end up being more around doing data science than like LLM prompting, just because I imagine this case, like, it might be more fruitful to have hard-coded questions because it's just a faster experience for the user.
Yeah.
Cool. Let's jump into some Dory questions. All right. I think the first question we talked about, right, was if we don't have any direct feedback, what can we use as proxies? There, ultimately, I think it's just going to be a mix of precision recall, a mix of cosine similarities and cohere rankers, just to give you an understanding of what the health of that system is. But ultimately, you really shouldn't read too much into it and really let yourself, again, like, try to build stuff for the direct customer. You can even use something like, if you use a language model to generate answers with citations, you can check whether or not the citations are actually, or whether the text chunks are actually being used by the language model, right? So if I present the language model with 20 text chunks and it cites nothing, again, maybe something's going on with the system. Remy's question was around what topic modeling tools do I recommend? I almost say they don't matter, but right now I've been using BERT topic a lot, and really it's just a matter of just organizing the question sets, right? If I have 10,000 questions and I know I only want to have maybe to look at 100, topic modeling is going to help me understand what are the common patterns. But even with topic modeling, I might just still say, if I have 15 topics, I want to see 10 examples of questions we served well and 10 examples of questions we didn't serve well. That still means I have to look at 200 questions. But at least I was able to look at 200 questions informed by the data of my 20,000 user query data dump. And then this is where I can maybe start discovering what exactly people are asking and see if there's any new capabilities that I can address or any kind of inventory that I'm lacking. And yeah, ideally, we're still looking at hundreds of questions. We kind of need topic modeling to help us process the tens of thousands of questions that we might be getting from our system. One question from Manikandan was, what are the triggers indicating static data sets require a refresh? There's really no hard and fast rule on this because it really depends on the nature of the data. Like, you could be really lazy and say, okay, well, when there's a thumbs down button, I'll just say that the thumbs down button, it could be like data was out of date, too slow, etc. But it's going to be very specific. For example, in the case of generating like RAG over documents, like code docs, there is a notion that the code is going to be out of date with the document. But if it was going to be RAG over laws or something, again, like, it's really hard to figure out if there's any kind of like data lineage that we can track over time. So unfortunately, I think that's going to be, for the most part, usage specific. Someone asked, would you prefer an agent for routing or would you prefer the classification approach? For that, it's going to be two things. With classification, it's going to be a lot faster, especially if we have a lot of examples. We can actually have better metric for what accuracy looks like for the classification set. That said, you'll still then need a language model to fill in the arguments of your routing if that's what's happening, right? And so if I ask the question, what was the latest papers on archive? I could classify it as a query that I need to run on archive, but I'll still need to figure out what latest means in the context of the topic that I'm searching for. And so that might still require like an LLM, in which case you might not actually be getting that much of a latency improvement. One question was around self-hosted LansDB. I'll answer that offline, mostly because I think most of what I've seen in production has been having all these Lans files hosted in something like S3 and then doing queries that way, but that also gets you like a big latency hit. Outside of that, I just use like a Fly.io or something like that to make hosting a lot simpler. I haven't done a lot of hosting on AWS since I left like big tech, so I'm going to avoid giving too many advice in that direction. This one is interesting. So how do we ensure most of our evals or metrics are exhaustive for the task we're working on after we've done the first launch? Is it good enough to start with something and add more as we find issues, or should we spend time thinking rigorously about them after we ship before we ship V2? This is really great because I think, especially when I work with a lot of engineering teams, they have this feeling that we need to have somehow unit tested this entire distribution of probabilistic software. And that's ultimately not how we can build software in a world where we're like deploying machine learning systems. Like it's roughly always just going to be like 70, 80% accurate unless you have some very specific use case that is well defined. So based on whether or not the company that you're building or the product that you're building can take on that much risk, I always lean towards shipping much more quickly, collecting feedback data, and just making sure that we are just reviewing the data frequently, right? So less about having the evals and metrics right away, but just going, hey, if we only get 100 thumbs down questions every week, every Friday, let's just like meet for 30 minutes and just look at all of them and see if any of them were really our fault, right? What other systems could we have built to address these questions? What was going on? And that review process is going to be much more useful for you than trying to like think about what your users might do, because chances are they're using your product in a way that's way worse than what you expected, or maybe they've become experts in ways that you did not anticipate, right? And it's just much better to just look at the real data than try to hypothesize what new users are trying to do. For QA tasks, can we generate questions from the document chunks as a starting point? What's the equivalent of summarization tasks? This is tricky because it's actually hard to build evals on what a high quality summarization is, but I'm going to post in the general Slack a piece of writing from Eugene Yang around doing evaluations for summarizations, and maybe that can give you guys some more specific ideas. But generally, summarization is very hard to evaluate in practice because what people care about is dramatically different, and I think the word summarization is a little bit underspecified. For example, I could pass in a 3-hour video, and then the summarization is just, this video is about a professor talking about the importance of calculus. That is a summary, but whether or not it's good or bad depends on, again, the product that you're building rather than the task itself. And then let me see. When choosing an embedding model for use with LansDB and Llama Index, does it make sense to choose a multimodal embedding model like LansDB recommends, or separate text and image embeddings? Is this question even correct? Again, here it would just be build a precision recall dataset and then evaluate whether or not having a multimodal embedding model is best. Like multimodal embedding models are usually trained on captioning data. So if you're asking for like objects in a scene, that's going to be helpful. But imagine you're doing search over screenshots and you want to find like moody screenshots or close-ups. It might not always be the case that the multimodal embedding works. And so in next week, we're going to talk about different techniques I've used to use visual language models to generate summaries and use those summaries to optimize for recall. Because yeah, like I think also with multimodal embeddings, then you have to start hosting them yourself. And there's other reasons why that is annoying. But again, it depends on kind of your latency trade-offs that you want to make and whether or not they actually improve your precision and recall evaluations. And yeah, those are all the questions from the poll. If anyone else has any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I still have like 14 minutes left before my next meeting, so I can stay on a little bit longer if needed. Cool. If anyone has any feedback, I know this week is a little bit challenging in terms of thinking about what capabilities look like in the abstract. But so if you have any feedback from this week's lecture or any questions on how to do this, kind of the homework that we talked about this week on clustering and classifying some of these things, just ask on the Slack and I'll be there to help you out. Great. Take care, everyone.